Good afternoon. Thank you for attending today's Labor Force Participation Task Force briefing. Our speakers are Dr. Bryan Grady, Director of Labor Market Information, and Dr. Erica von Nessen, Research Economist. During the session, our speakers will provide an overview of the Labor Force Participation Task Force, explain the research studies conducted over the past year, and provide policy recommendations for improving labor force participation. The session is being recorded. The recording and slides will be available after the session on the DEW website at dew.sc.gov/taskforce. Please type your questions into the chat. We will leave time at the end to answer your questions. Without further delay, Dr. Bryan Grady.
All right, thank you, Nina. Excuse me. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to just go ahead and jump in and talk a little bit about what the task force has been up to and the findings from the research that's been commissioned. So we'll start with this slide. So this is sort of our problem statement chart. It's actually gotten worse since we made this chart. South Carolina's labor force participation rate is 56.3%, which is the fourth lowest among the 50 states. What that means is of people 16 or older who are eligible to work, that's the percentage that are working or actively seeking employment. So you can see here on this chart that up until about the mid-90s, South Carolina, which is the blue line on the chart, was roughly in line with the green line, the United States labor force participation rate. But then starting in the late 90s, and then particularly in the 2001 and 2008 recessions, there was a substantial decline in our participation rate. And that has only continued since. So whereas the nation as a whole is a little over 62% of eligible workers are in the labor force, South Carolina is lagging well behind on that metric. So this was obviously something of great concern. These statistics are actually produced by my team in the Labor Market Information Division, and the alarm bells were ringing around here of if we're gonna have a dynamic workforce that supports economic development activity that makes South Carolina a prosperous place to live, this is a concerning metric. So that's sort of the inspiration for why the task force came to be. We had our first meeting back in March of 2022, and then 2 additional meetings in April, and subsequent meetings in the fall. The task force consisted of 11 people. Erica and I served on the task force as due representatives, but we brought in a wide swath of people from elsewhere. We brought in labor economists from our state's flagship universities. We brought in public sector experts. We brought in private sector experts. We brought in people from places like LinkedIn and ZipRecruiter that are knee deep in labor market data all the time. We got all these people together and we started asking the question, what's going on here and what do we do about it? So as mentioned earlier, all of our materials are at dew.sc.gov/taskforce. Recordings of meetings, minutes of meetings, white papers, other products, the results of these research studies that I'll talk about later, they're all there. So I would certainly encourage everybody to take a look at that. So what came out of these 3 meetings in the spring of 2022 was a sense that we needed to produce 2 research products and do commissioned these products through a procurement process. So one was sort of a macroeconomic analysis where we looked at the question of what are the big picture things that are driving this. And Erica will speak about that later in this presentation. The other research project was a survey that we decided to commission. So here's how that worked. So from the every cloud has a silver lining category, because so many people filed for unemployment benefits in the initial wave of the pandemic in the spring of 2020, that made it possible for us to follow up with them later. So what we decided to do was, with this survey, we decided to combine our wage records that are from the unemployment insurance tax system with our benefits data. So we identified a cohort of people who were in our wage records in 2019. So they were working for an employer that was paying UI taxes. They filed a unemployment insurance claim in 2020, and then were not in our wage records in 2021. And as we'll go into, there are a number of reasons why that might be the case, but this certainly suggests there's a group of people who have been in the labor force recently, do not appear in our records. That's a natural group of people to question, right? So what we did was work with a vendor, Milan Chicago LLC, to develop a survey that was then deployed via email to this population. So this was over 150,000 people that we sent this survey to, because there were, as I said, there were so many people who filed for unemployment in 2020. Of those, a little over 6,000 responded, a 4% response rate. Considering most people do not respond to unsolicited contacts, whether that's by email or phone, that came across as a pretty good number for us, and certainly over 6,000 people is enough to extrapolate some general conclusions about this population. You don't necessarily want to extrapolate this out to everybody who's not in the labor force, but this group that was in our wage records in 2019. So it was a fairly short survey, less than 5 minutes, just trying to hit the highlights, get some demographic information, and figure out what these people are up to and what's on their mind. So let's get into it. So sort of the big picture number here. So 46% of the people who responded to the survey told us that they actually were employed. Now, there are a number of reasons how this could be the case. People who own their own businesses or are contractors or gig economy workers, people like that, they're contractors. They do not show up in our wage records because they're not an employer is not paying UI taxes for them. They could have also moved out of state, and so they're in some other state's wage records, or they have some other employment, and I'll just leave it at that. Something that's not on our records. 26% of people who responded to the survey indicated that they were not working and were not available to work. So they are people who are either full-time students, retirees, disability and health, caregivers, people who are just like, I'm not in the labor force, I'm not interested, I'm fine. So you subtract that out, that leaves 20% of people who basically told us they're not working, but they could. So these are the people that are the most interesting, right? These are the people who are not in labor force, but could conceivably be brought into the labor force with some sort of policy intervention. So we asked that group of people a lot more questions. So the question of who is in this group, as I said, we asked some demographic questions. So people who responded that they were Black or African Americans, 32% of that population qualified as not working but available to work. 33% of people 54 and older. Not surprising that when you filter out people who are at or near retirement age, that number increases. 31% of people with less than a college degree, and 37% of people living in Tier 4 counties. So for those of you who are not familiar, the Department of Revenue, for purposes of administering a job creation tax credit, ranks counties into 4 tiers. Tier 1 are the most prosperous counties. Tier 4 are the most economically distressed counties. So these are areas that are overall very poor, are overwhelmingly rural in character, generally speaking, and are sort of the most marginal parts of the South Carolina economy, unfortunately. So 37% of people in those counties indicated that they were not working but available to work. And here's how this looks geographically. So for those, again, for those of you who may not be familiar, these are the 12 local workforce development areas in our state, which are in Greenville's case, a single county, but in most cases, all other cases, a group of counties. And you can see here that sort of the middle swath of the state is the area that has the highest percentage of respondents who indicated that they were in this not working but available to work category. You see that in particular, they're the Santee Lynches and Lower Savannah workforce regions. All right. So moving on from that, when we asked this group of people, what is preventing you from being part of the workforce? The number one answer was low pay. Now, this is perhaps somewhat curious, especially considering wage growth at the bottom end of the economic spectrum has been incredibly hot the last 2 years. Even with inflation, it has outpaced inflation. So this was a somewhat surprising result. And it's also a result that we're not really sure entirely what it means, whether it is people who have unrealistic expectations of how much their labor is worth, or whether it is a situation where employers simply are not offering a competitive wage uh, to compete with alternatives to working. You can see the rest of the options on the table. I'm not going to read through all of them. You see that there's sort of three that kind of fall into a caregiver category. So optimal hours not available. So they're unable to find a shift that meets their needs. Lack of childcare or desire to stay with a child rather than placing that child in childcare. So those are all on the board there. So let's go ahead and move on. So we also asked, we broke this out by men versus women who responded to the survey. So you can see here that those caregiver metrics that I mentioned earlier, those are much more likely to be issues for women than men, not particularly surprising here. So on the other hand, men were more likely to indicate that a criminal record was a barrier to entry in the workforce, as well as a lack of information about jobs, which as someone who is the labor market information director is sort of a challenge thrown at my feet to help remedy. But you can see the rest of them on there. A fair number of these did not have substantial differences by sex. When we look at it by race, and I will say we obviously asked people other than those who identified as white and black, but there wasn't a large enough sample to get statistically significant numbers out of it. So we're just kind of comparing these two groups. You can see here that African American respondents were more likely to indicate a criminal record or a lack of training as an issue, as a barrier to entry, whereas white respondents were more likely to indicate that they felt they were too old to obtain employment, or that they had low self-esteem. And this is another one that sort of raised some eyebrows here at DO when we got these results back. But essentially, this is a group of people who are saying, I don't feel like I have any marketable skills. I don't interview well. I don't do well holding a job. And so they sort of self-select out of the labor force. So that's another set of questions raised there. You also see white response were somewhat more likely to indicate that health was a challenge. In fact, that was the top barrier to entry for white respondents. While some people indicated that they were unable to be in the labor force because of their health, this is a group of people who said they could, but perhaps unable to find a job that would accommodate a chronic health condition or other issue like that. When you look at it by age, not surprisingly, the top barrier to entry for people 55 and older is the age issue. 36% of respondents indicated that was a challenge. For 24 and younger, you see low pay as the top answer, as well as for 25 and 54. Not going to go through that in great detail. One worth noting at the bottom there is lack of computer skills. I will note this is an email survey, so it's not people indicating that they don't know how to use a computer, but perhaps that they don't have specialized training in certain software that's necessary to access employment opportunities in their area. And again, coming back to the county tier question. So you can see here, tiers 1, 2, and 3 broadly similar answers. Low pay was the top barrier to entry across tiers 1, 2, and 3. But then you look at the far right, tier 4, the number one barrier to entry is a lack of transportation. So again, we're dealing with an area where people are in very rural communities. And what this is suggesting is these are people who there's very little public transportation in these areas. They're likely to be reliant on a car, and if their car doesn't work or they don't have a car, then they're not able to access those employment opportunities. So that's certainly a challenge. When we look at what responses were more common in specific local workforce development areas, you can see what that looks like. So you can look for your part of the state on this list. I'm not going to read it all off. But there were some substantial regional variances, but nothing particularly dramatic. So then when we asked people, well, what would convince you to return to the workforce? The answers are not surprising if you saw what was identified as the barriers to entry. So you'll see here, high pay was the number one answer. So obviously people looking for higher wages. Second was flexible working conditions. So this would be situations where, assuming the job, assuming it fits the circumstances, we're talking about remote and hybrid work situations here, different modes of participating in the labor force. It is worth noting that during the pandemic, we had the highest recorded rate of employment among persons with disabilities, in part because a lot of jobs went remote. And so those people who ordinarily would not be able to have a standard office job were able to hold down a remote job. Third is location close to home. This gets back again to that transportation question. Also gets to the question of is there affordable housing near employment centers? And then the fourth one is flexible hours, which I think again gets back to this caregiving question. I think a lot of people would like flexible hours, but it's certainly more urgent for someone who is taking care of a child or an elderly parent or someone else. So those were the four, and you can see basically no other answer was a meaningful contributor on this metric. So in terms of key takeaways, I think you've heard some of them already through this talk. You can see here that we sort of have this number one imperative, and this is one that can address most immediately, is improve communication about relevant job opportunities. So you see there again, increased availability of childcare and rural transportation, since those are barriers to entry. If there are ways that we can get people to the workforce or have programs that facilitate childcare, make it more available, those could potentially be opportunities to increase labor force participation. Enhanced accommodations for persons with health issues. I talked about disabilities earlier, but more broadly, making sure that we are not artificially keeping people out of the labor force by not having accommodations that can allow them to work and be productive members of society. And then facilitating more flexible working conditions where possible. Again, for circumstances where remote or hybrid work is a possibility, that may allow businesses to see a wider swath of applicants. And again, we kind of get back to this question of what low pay means to the respondents. And I will say we did not ask for specific dollar amounts or things like that. We were trying to keep this a very short survey to keep the response rate up. So this may be something that requires some follow-up. As I said, do people have unrealistic expectations, or are businesses simply not providing a wage that is high enough to attract people to work? So we might consider a focus group or other steps in the future to try to evaluate that in more detail. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Erica, who will speak about the other research that was commissioned.
Thank you, Bryan. As Bryan said, my name is Erica von Nessen, and I'm a research economist at the agency. So the survey really gave us a lot of detailed information about what individuals were saying in terms of their barriers to entry to reemployment. The second piece of research that was commissioned was trying to look at a more aggregate kind of 30,000-foot view. So the Tamura study covered several dimensions, including a literature review, a decomposition analysis, a regional and industry analysis, and also some high-level policy and strategy implications. The full report is available on our website, and I would encourage you who are interested in learning a little bit more about the background of each of those sections to review that at your leisure, but I will go through some of the highlights of each of these. So to start with the literature review, looking at the academic literature in terms of factors that were found to be negatively associated with labor force participation rate, I don't think any of these would necessarily come as a shock. Number one being an aging population. This is something that the nation is facing, but South Carolina is really facing it at a more extreme level, and I will show you some evidence for that in the coming slides. So with older populations, people are approaching retirement age, going to have lower labor force participation rates as a result. For younger adults, we have evidence that they're spending more time on school and less time in non-school activities, including work. So those people who may have in the past had part-time jobs while in high school or in college, that seems to be on the decline, and as a result, lower labor force participation rates. The increased use of opioids and higher rates of disability have contributed to lower labor force participation rates, as well as increased globalization, moving our low-skilled manufacturing jobs overseas. And there's concern there about whether or not people who lost those jobs would be able to successfully move into other jobs that are available in their area. They may end up sitting on the sidelines rather than transitioning. And finally, there's been some newer research done looking at improvements in video game technology, which is raising the value of leisure over work. So you think of the stereotype of someone, maybe staying with mom and dad in the basement doing video games, but it is a concern. One of the highest rates of decline in labor force participation is amongst younger age males. So those are all factors that the literature was found to be negatively associated with labor force participation. So in terms of the actual analysis that was done using data from South Carolina as well as other states, Chmura found that aging is the #1 factor that has caused a decline in South Carolina's labor force between 1994 and 2019. And really this first slide kind of shows that. So if we look at the median age by state, South Carolina is the red line. So in 2000, our average or median age was about 35.5, very, very similar to North Carolina, 35.4, and Georgia's a bit younger at 33.4. But over the past 2 decades, we can actually see quite a divergence between each of our states. A year difference in the median age is quite significant. So by the year 2019, we can see in South Carolina, the median age is approaching 40, almost a full year older than our North Carolina counterpart, and significantly above Georgia at 37.2. And so aging has definitely resulted in our labor force participation rate coming down more quickly than some of the surrounding states. And in fact, our population over the age of 65 has nearly doubled over that time period, from about 12% to a little more than 23%. And so the Chmura study does a decomposition analysis, and I'm not going to go necessarily into the math behind that, but essentially they were saying if we held our population distribution constant, so we don't see that aging as much, how would that have affected our rate? And what they find is that about 3/4 of the fall in our labor force participation rate can be accounted for by the increasing share of the population over the age of 65. And so one of the things I didn't mention on the previous slide is, South Carolina has long been a known destination for retirees. So especially from the Northeast and the Midwest, coming down here to a more temperate climate, a lower cost of living, housing markets usually a lot cheaper than some of the other metro areas. And so we have been known as a retirement destination, and that's great. But that also comes along with individuals coming to our state who are not necessarily going to be working. On the opposite end, we're also not necessarily historically known as a state for up-and-coming young professionals. So we don't necessarily have an Atlanta, a Charlotte, a Raleigh-Durham area that was attracting young working professionals. Now, I will say probably in the last decade, Greenville and Charleston have come about more in that kind of space, but I think kind of both ends of that spectrum have contributed to our aging quite a bit faster than our surrounding states. And so the Chmura study also looked at a decomposition for North Carolina and Georgia and found that aging, again, definitely contributed to their declines in labor force participation rate, but only about 60% of Georgia's and about 55% for North Carolina. So Bryan, can you go back real quick? So one of the things that we do see that's kind of good news is that in terms of aging, it's not something we can necessarily stop, but the population, as we continue to improve health outcomes for individuals as they age, we are seeing more people over the age of 55 who are continuing to work, particularly amongst women. And that can actually offset some of the decline. So it's not necessarily that we're saying we need everyone to work a full-time job over the age of 65 or over the age of 55, but definitely improving labor force participation rates of our older workers can help as we continue to see that aging. The bad news here is that the prime age population, those between the ages of 25 and 54, has not only become a smaller share of the labor force over time, but it also saw a decline in participation. So that's something where we're going to have to look to other policy levers to figure out what's going on with those ages 25 to 54, because their labor force participation is declining at the same time that the population is aging. So kind of a double whammy there. And just to kind of hammer that home a little bit more, this slide looks at the different generations and their makeup in the labor force over time. So on the left-hand side, you see the different generations. We have the baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z, along with their corresponding ages. And if you look at the column labeled 1992, you can see that over half of the workforce in 1992 consisted of baby boomers. And that has slowly declined over time as they have reached retirement age. And now in 2022, only about 18% of our workforce consists of baby boomers, and millennials have become the largest share of the workforce. The problem is that there's just not as many millennials as there were of baby boomers. The National Center for Health Statistics estimates that there were about 76 million baby boomers born in the US. That compares to only about 62 million millennials. So if we're trying to replace one for one every baby boomer who's retiring, we just don't have the capacity to do that with the population that was born in those subsequent generations. And there have been estimates that in order for the millennial population to reach the same peak level of workforce that the baby boomers did, that our participation rate would need to be somewhere close to 88%. And we're definitely nowhere near that point in terms of labor force participation. So really the point of this slide is just to say the labor shortage, while it was exacerbated somewhat during the COVID pandemic, this is not a short-term issue. It's one that's going to be with the US and with South Carolina for a number of years. So the second factor that Jamira looked at in terms of some of the mathematical decomposition exercises was education. And the graph on the right shows the labor force participation rate for individuals ages 16 to 24, so your high school and college age workers. And what you can see is that in 1990, about 2/3 of that group had some kind of attachment to the labor force. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they were all working full-time jobs. Some of them were working full-time, some of them part-time, but that has declined dramatically to less than 50% by 2019. And so that's a group of people that used to have jobs again, during their high school and college years that are not working or do not appear to be working at the same rate today. And so encouraging participation in this group is something that we can do, but we also have to be very careful about that because we don't necessarily want to push people out of education and into employment. It really needs to be something where we can look at both, because educational attainment actually tends to increase labor force participation, which I'll show you on the next slide. So the graph on the left shows the labor force participation rate by educational attainment. So those with a bachelor's degree or higher, their educational attainment is above their labor force participation rate is above 85%. If you compare that with those with less than a high school diploma, they're less than 53%. So improving the educational attainment of the state is an important goal for increasing labor force participation. So while there may be a population of people in that 16 to 24-year-old demographic that we may be able to attract back into the workforce, we don't necessarily want to do that at the expense of their further education. And in fact, if our educational attainment had stayed the same as it was in 1994, our labor force participation rate today would have been about 4 percentage points lower than it actually is. So moving into the next piece, I'm looking at some industry and regional differences in labor force participation rate and possible explanations for why South Carolina has seen such a dramatic decline. And the Jamira report points out that between 1994 and 2010, South Carolina lost over 100,000 jobs in textile mills and apparel manufacturing. This was also occurring in North Carolina as well. But the graph on the right, you see the top two lines are total employment growth in South Carolina and the US. And between 1994 and 2001, South Carolina's total employment did quite well. We rose about 15%, very much in line with the US. But on the manufacturing side, US manufacturing suffered. They lost about 5% of manufacturing jobs over that time period, while South Carolina lost about 15% of the manufacturing jobs. And the hypothesis is that there are many workers in those industries that were lost that would not necessarily have been able to transfer their skills immediately to another job in their area, or to be able to find abilities to move into kind of surrounding areas. So that the types of jobs that were lost were not able to be easily replaced, and that we ended up with several, thousands of people on the sidelines who may have been discouraged in terms of their work opportunities because they couldn't find jobs that would fit their skill sets, or they did not necessarily feel that retraining was the right option for them. And one of the particular areas that we see this happen is in our more rural areas. So labor force participation rates by county are shown in this map here. The darker areas are our metro areas. They tend to have higher labor force participation rates. Some of our more rural counties tend to have lower rates, and we really have a wide range. So a high of 64.7% in Charleston County to a low of 34.4% in Allendale. And what the Chmura study pointed out is that particularly for the rural areas that lost manufacturing, they really suffered in terms of their labor force participation rate declines. And so the thought is, what do we need to do in terms of looking at solutions for the labor force participation rate problem? Well, it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all, and it's certainly not going to be a one-size-fits-all for rural versus urban areas. So they looked specifically at counties with population densities of less than 155 people per square mile and found that their average labor force participation rate is about 8.4 percentage points lower than the more urbanized counties. And this disparity was even larger for some demographic groups. So if you look at the first line here, for men living in rural counties, their participation rate was only 71.8% compared to 82.2% for men in urban areas. So a 10 percentage point difference there. So solutions that we implement across the state may not be the best solutions for every county. So there may be unique challenges, and I think Bryan has already mentioned transportation being one of them, where we're going to have to tailor things to specific areas in order to address labor force participation rates in rural versus urban settings. And the final piece of the Chmura study that I wanted to go over today was a regression analysis. So they looked at labor force participation rates by county and did an analysis of what are some of the factors that can help explain labor force participation rate. And one of the surprising things, at least to me, was the very first one here, which is a greater share of men in the county is associated with a lower labor force participation rate. There's nearly a 1-for-1 inverse correlation. So for every 1 percentage point increase in males in the county, you have a 1 percentage point decline in the labor force participation rate. And that's surprising because historically, we've always seen labor force participation rates of men much higher than women, typically because women are ones who stay home with children during their childbearing age. And so to see that having more men is actually associated with lower labor force participation rate is surprising and is of concern. The second piece is that they did find that rural counties have marginally lower labor force participation rates when holding other factors constant, but rural areas that were able to maintain their manufacturing employment were a bit insulated from the large labor force participation rate reductions. So if you think about the company towns, if there were company towns that lost their company, obviously that was much more impactful for their labor force participation rate versus those who maybe lost some manufacturing jobs in the 90s and early 2000s, but was able to either retain some or to supplement with other types of growing industries in their area, particularly in the manufacturing sector. And then the percentage of the population with a disability does have a negative impact on labor force participation rate, but it's fairly small. So the Chmura study also offered up some, again, very high-level policy recommendations that we hope to go through more in phase 2 of the task force, which we'll talk about shortly, to really tighten these up, but kind of at a 30,000-foot level. The first is, and I think Bryan mentioned this quite a number of times in the survey results, providing higher paying jobs will likely improve labor force across regions and demographics. Money speaks to all groups, essentially. For older workers, developing job placement programs that are designed for them, they have unique challenges or unique wishes at that stage of their life. Dedicating staff at workforce centers to assist these workers and encouraging self-employment and updating skills to be able for them to transfer to new jobs. For workers with disabilities, adopting a framework of employment as the first and preferred option, as well as incentivizing private sector employment for businesses who employ people with disabilities or for individuals who own their own business. For young adults, we already saw that there was a dramatic decline in their participation in the labor force. So strengthening career-related content in middle school and high school, exposing them to work opportunities, especially high-quality opportunities like paid internships and job shadowing, supporting summer youth employment programs as well as apprenticeships. We didn't talk much about the formerly incarcerated in my section, but we do know that was a barrier identified by some of our survey respondents. So helping job seekers explaining their criminal history or gaps in employment history, as well as removing overly restrictive policies on hiring and licensing. For rural workers, again, we come back to that transportation issue being one that stands out for sure, encouraging programs such as organized carpooling and studying the feasibility of establishing additional public transit. For workers in declining industries, building programs to help them transfer skills or making sure that they're aware of programs that already exist. Again, this is something that our agency can help with. We have existing programs and the technical college system has existing programs, et cetera. But on the kind of opposite end, in addition to getting new skills, having the economic development look to attract employers to an area based on the skill set of available residents. So if there's a pool of people that have a particular skill, trying to match that on the front end, as well as working to build transferable skills. And finally, for caregivers, encouraging private sector employers to offer more family-friendly policies, which can include flexible work schedules, paid family leave, and childcare vouchers. And that is my summary of the Chimera stuff. Again, I recommend, if you want more information, to visit our website. And at that, I will give it back to Nina.
Thank you. Before we address questions in the chat, I'd like to provide a roadmap for the next phase of the task force. The research findings discussed today highlight several key barriers that may prevent or make it difficult for individuals to return to work. The task force will be augmented with subject matter experts that can help to develop actionable strategies and well-defined policy recommendations for overcoming these barriers. The next task force meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, February 21st. All right, there are several questions in the chat, and we'll take the rest of our time to walk through each of those questions. The first is, the survey data available outside of your department, particularly to other organizations and employees who can personally work with the 28% who don't work but can or want to? Or is this considered private information that can't be distributed? How do you connect employees with the 28%? So Dr. Grady or Dr. Von Nessen, would one of you like to respond to this question?
Sure, I'll go ahead and take this one. The short answer is I believe we can make the data available. It would obviously be de-identified without any personal information. We'd probably have to make sure that there wasn't any other issues with it, but I don't see an issue with releasing the microdata in principle so that people can do their own analysis on potential correlates with labor force decision making. As for the broader question of how to connect with the 28%, I mean, I would say that that's a role that should be playing, and we'll certainly be investigating ways to do that, ways to enhance our SC Works infrastructure and build upon the relationships and programs that we already have to connect with both job seekers and employers. So I think that's our first pass at an answer anyway.
And Brian, I'll just add to that. The survey was anonymous. We did not ask for them to identify themselves, so we would not be able to necessarily give you any identifying information with the survey, even if we wanted to, because those were anonymous.
Right, the next question I will take, are the slides available to share with us? And yes, the recording of today's session and the slide deck will be available on the task force website, and that's dew.sc.gov/taskforce. And the web address is also on this slide that's being displayed to the audience right now. With the quiet quitting trend, do you think more pay can help retain staff, or should South Carolina businesses focus on other incentives to deter turnover?
Well, I think the answer to that is going to vary pretty substantially based on the type of business and what the local labor market situation is. So I don't think there's going to be a one size fits all. I mean, I think all else being equal, yes, if businesses offer a higher wage, that's going to attract a wider swath of potential talent. But there's a lot of factors there that would make it hard to provide an authoritative answer for all types of employers. But that's where the resources that the Labor Market Information Division offers may be able to help in terms of getting a better handle on local wages and employment levels and things like that. So I'll do a quick plug for our website, which is scworkforceinfo.com, or you can just shoot me an email personally, or the LMI inbox, which is lmicustomerservice@do.sc.gov. So if employers have questions about what's going on in their industry or what's going on in their community, we are ready and willing to help.
What do the respondents consider to be high pay or low pay? Do we have any insight into that?
Not really. I think I mentioned this briefly when going over the survey results, that for trying to keep the survey compact and easy to respond to try to keep the response rate up, we did not ask for detailed questions like in economics, the term of art is a reservation wage. What would be the amount of money that you would need to be interested in employment? And I think, again, that's also going to vary pretty dramatically by location, demographics, previous work history, things like that. So I think that there's not going to be a single number, but as I mentioned, that's something that we could potentially do a deeper dive on in future analysis to try to get a handle on what are those reservation wages, what are the points at which people are would become interested in seeking employment.
We have another question about pay and wages. How high is higher pay? With the current inflation rate, cost of living has increased, and companies increasing pay might not be enough. What is recommended?
So again, we don't have an exact answer of how high is high. And I would also say that it is a bit above my pay grade to suggest what businesses should pay their workers. Certainly cost of living has been a challenge. We've seen the inflation rate increase substantially. It seems to be on the decline, and that is happening at the same time that the overall labor market is still stable. So that's encouraging. But I think that's all I got.
All right, the next question is, I expect that Dr. Grady will address this, but if not, are there any pilot programs being developed that might recruit the people who are not working but available for work? And I don't mind taking a stab at this, and then Dr. Grady and Dr. Von Nessen, you can add on as well. But our agency has been very proactive in trying to develop workforce development programs to identify those individuals that are on the sidelines, to bring them back into the workforce. And as Dr. Grady mentioned, we have several programs already available through the SC Work system and programs that our agency has developed and implemented over the last few years to help facilitate this transition into the workforce. And what we'll be looking at doing specifically in the next phase is really identifying more actionable strategies to improve upon those workforce development programs. One of the pilots that was done as a corollary to the Labor Force Participation Task Force was called a Direct Connect program that was done in Lawrence County. And the idea there was to identify those individuals at a county level who are not participating in the workforce, but who are interested to participate, and connect them with employment resources to help facilitate that transition back to work. And so we're evaluating the outcomes of that project to determine whether it is a successful model that can be implemented in other counties across the state. And so that's just one example of a pilot that has been undertaken in response to the survey results. Dr. Grady or Dr. Von Nessen, do you want to add anything else to that?
No, I think that pretty much covered it.
All right. The next question, I don't think people have unrealistic expectations. I think these people who aren't participating in the labor force see how underpaid workers are, and they think it won't make enough difference to get a job themselves. I personally have a good job position and still feel like I'm very underpaid. And so I think that's more of a comment just around the wage discussion and not necessarily a question. But are there any responses that the two speakers want to offer to that?
I mean, I think that's certainly a valid critique. I think that that's certainly the case for some percentage of people. You know, I think it would require more in-depth analysis to try to nail that down more precisely.
Yeah.
And Bryan, I don't know if we've mentioned it earlier, but there's also the thought of it may not be necessarily they have unrealistic expectations about wages, but if the skill set that they have qualifies them for $15 an hour, but their childcare costs $16 an hour, there may be reasons they're saying it's not high enough that are not just kind of pie in the sky optimistic hopes for a wage, but actually, sitting down with a pen and paper and figuring out for their own personal budgets, how much are they going to have to make it, make financial sense.
Right. The next question is specifically for Dr. Von Nessen. You mentioned job industry changes contributing to labor force declines and participation. How much transfer from one industry to another do we see? And this is a multi-part question, so I'll start there and then I'll read the next part of the question. So the first part is how much transfer from one industry to another do we see?
Yeah. So that's actually something we've been trying to look more closely at, and we're hoping to have some data here kind of in the spring once we get our full year 2022 data in place, but kind of some preliminary analysis that we were looking at. The majority of people that, if we compare what they were doing in 2019 to what they're doing in 2022, I'd say more than half of people stayed within the same industry. If you want to look at specific industries or you have questions about that, the Census Bureau has a tool called Job to Job Explorer. And I'm sure Bryan and his staff would be happy to help with understanding that because it can be a little confusing. But you can actually look at people in terms of the movement between industries. And I think you can break it down below the state level. And I think they may even have some demographic information in there as well. So we're doing a little bit of looking into that. I don't think the transitioning was as high as I thought it might be. I know one of the particular areas that we started looking at was leisure and hospitality because there was so much drop in that employment. And then there was a lot of concern about not being able to hire those workers back after the pandemic. And so we found, definitely more than half of the people that were in leisure and hospitality stayed in leisure and hospitality, but there's always going to be some kind of movement in between industries. So I would recommend the Census Bureau as one possible source or contacting Bryan and his group to see if there's specific areas you're interested in.
And the question does offer specific transition or an example, manufacturers that are becoming IT specialists.
Ooh, now that's an interesting one because if the IT specialist is working within the manufacturing industry, then we're going to still consider them part of the manufacturing industry. So that kind of, I think Bryan will hurt me if I don't plug. It would be wonderful if South Carolina could expand our wage records to get information about occupations that people are doing, because right now, if that person was working as a machinist at a company and then they transitioned into IT within the same company, we don't see that on our end. We just see that they're still working in the manufacturing industry.
And the last part of the question is, what are the top industries in South Carolina with the best earnings?
Bryan, I'm going to turn that one back over to you if you have anything off the top of your head.
Not off the top of my head. If you, how about we come back to that? I will have some data to present on that point. Yes.
All right, the next question here, millennials will make up the majority of the workforce, but how many are actually in C-suite positions who have any power to make changes in the labor force? It's difficult when boomers and Gen Xers are at the top, but do not redistribute wealth with rising costs and a recession on the horizon, if not already here. And again, that was more of a statement. I don't know if there's any response from our speakers to this question or to the statement.
In terms of specific data on that point, I'm not aware of anything that gets into the level of detail of the ages of corporate leaders or things like that. Eric, are you aware of any resource like that?
No, I wasn't. I was going to say I'm not aware of a data set really that would address that.
All right, so back to the question that was asked earlier about wages. So the highest wages in South Carolina are in the manufacturing sector. As of December, the average manufacturing worker, and again, that's workers who work for a manufacturing company, not necessarily people who are actively on an assembly line or something like that, earned $1,289 per week on average. And that's followed by professional and business services at $1,208, financial activities at $1,200, and construction at $1,175. The overall average statewide is $992. So there you go.
Thank you. If the only jobs available are textile factories and manufacturing, or mostly lower paying blue collar work, how do you convince people to join the labor force if there aren't enough high paying jobs for everyone? It's a lot of labor for a small return on value. What solutions are there?
So I think this might have come from that graph that Erica spoke to about the textile mills employment declining and manufacturing in South Carolina declining in the late 90s. I think that was just sort of, that's an artifact of, as I mentioned earlier, that's the time period where the two lines sort of diverge on the chart, where you see a substantial separation in labor force participation. I don't think we were saying that that was a representative sample of employment, but I'm sorry, what was the original question?
Well, the question spoke to there not being enough high-paying jobs for everyone who wants one.
Right. Yes. So I mean, I would say that is that is why the folks at the Department of Commerce do what they do in terms of trying to attract corporate investment to South Carolina, to make sure that there are employers who who offer a path to advancement, that we're not just seen as the low end of the value chain, but that we have jobs in South Carolina that are higher on the value chain, that are more knowledge economy kind of jobs. So that's something that economic development professionals are certainly working on, both at the state level and the local level. So I think that's where that lies, is on that end.
Is there any prevalence of workers in the state who use part-time freelance work as a means to get higher pay, as in juggling two jobs brings in more money than just a full-time position?
This is another one where I think the data exists. I just don't have it at my fingertips. Erica, would you happen to know off the top of your head?
So I know definitely within our wage records, we see a lot of people with 2 or even 3 jobs reported in the same quarter. We're not necessarily always able to distinguish between whether they've transitioned from one full-time job to another, but I suspect a lot of people have multiple jobs. Now, we're not going to see any of the freelance work in our records here at the agency, but even amongst just kind of your normal salary and wage positions, we see people holding multiple jobs.
Great. What are the next steps to these policy recommendations? Will DEW submit proposals or work with legislators to influence businesses? And I'll take this one. The plan is for us to convene a phase 2, or to continue the task force work by augmenting the task force with some subject matter experts that are able to speak to the barriers that were identified in the survey and some of the reasons why labor force participation has declined that came out of the Chimera study. And the goal is, in this next phase of the task force, to really define effective strategies and policy recommendations that can be then submitted to policymakers and workforce development, education, and employer partners to begin implementing some of those strategies to help improve labor force participation. We have a question about whether this information can be presented to other oversight or coordinating bodies, and I think the answer to that is absolutely. We'd be happy to coordinate a presentation with other boards or governing bodies that are interested in learning more about labor force participation. The next question: how can DEW work with employers to help retrain displaced workers for roles in healthcare or in other high need areas. And I can take a stab at this, and Bryan and Erica can also weigh in if they would like. But one of the things that we use quite often as a tool to upskill, so not necessarily retraining, but upskilling employees, is through incumbent worker training. So those individuals who are already employed, maybe in a position, but want to seek entry into another position, we can use incumbent worker training models to upskill those individuals for other positions. We also have existing programs such as on-the-job training, where an individual can enter a new career pathway, and we can work with that employer to cover some of the cost of training that new employee for an occupation. So I think there are several different models that can be used to train and upskill individuals who are looking for career change. I think the first piece of that, though, is educating individuals on those jobs that are in demand and the skill requirements for those jobs, and how to access the retraining or upskilling resources that are available to help them enter that profession. How much worse will this situation become in about 5 years when most baby boomers age out of the labor force? Where are we going to get the workers we need to keep pace with the growing economy?
Well, so I think the immediate answer is it will continue to be an issue. Certainly there's, once you get to the 5 to 10 year horizon, within that time period, you would expect the vast majority of baby boomers to be out of the workforce. So that would certainly exacerbate some of the trends that we've already identified. On the other hand, some factors, some of the things that happened during COVID have started to reverse themselves. There were a lot of people who took early retirement, probably because they didn't feel safe because of the health situation, who then have since in substantial numbers come back into the workforce. So I would say that some elements of this were COVID specific, but there is the overall demographic challenge. And as for where we're going to get the workers, I mean, I think there's data that came out about a month ago from the Census Bureau that showed that South Carolina was the third fastest growing state in the country in terms of raw population count between 2021 and 2022. On the flip side of that, though, as we've discussed, a large percentage of those people were our older adults who are at or near retirement age. And the other dimension of that is it is purely reliant on people moving to South Carolina. The actual, what's called the natural increase, births minus deaths, that's actually a negative number. So to keep the state growing, we have to keep being an attractive destination for people. And ideally, as we talked about earlier, an attractive destination for a wide swath of people at all age points, and particularly for skilled professionals, to make sure that we have a workforce that can support the economic development activities. And obviously we have the programs that Nina and her team administer, as well as the things at SE Work Centers that are designed to try to upskill and reskill the existing workforce to make sure they're able to meet the needs of a changing economy.
All right, and the last question we have here, is there any data specific for veteran employment participation rate by county?
So, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Erica, I think you could get that from the American Community Survey, but the challenge with that is that that's on a substantial lag. So at the county level, for small and mid-sized counties in South Carolina, you'd be dealing with a 5-year average number. So 2017 through 2021 averaged together. It's essentially a sample size issue, where when you're already talking about a fairly small county, where we're generating estimates that already have a substantial margin of error, then trying to slice and dice that to look at veterans specifically, you need that sort of expanded time horizon. So I think the answer is there are data available, but they may not be as timely as sort of a month by month rolling sort of estimate.
Would the state be willing to support massive out-of-state communications campaigns to recruit workers to South Carolina?
Well, obviously, I'm not going to speak for the governor or the legislature or anyone like that. As for whether that's an approach that works, I know that some states have tried that at scale. From what I've seen, I think the evidence is mixed on whether that's an effective campaign. I would consider myself somewhat skeptical that will work. I've seen it up close, and I think the fact is, if people are going to move a long distance, they are likely going to do it for a specific job, not for a general sort of move for amenities, except of course, as we've mentioned repeatedly, for people who are retirement age who obviously are not seeking employment and can select a location purely on those factors.
Bryan, I will mention we did do some kind of border work. So we have done some recruitment job fairs kind of at the borders, so like the North Carolina, South Carolina, Charlotte area. So trying to attract some of the people from maybe North Carolina or Georgia may be something that we would be more focused on, because they'd probably be more willing to commute from, say, like outside of Charlotte in the North Carolina area down to York County or across the border to Aiken or something like that.
Yes. Yeah.
All right, this concludes today's briefing session. As a reminder, a recording of the briefing sessions will be available on the DEW website at dew.sc.gov/taskforce. The website also includes the full-length research reports discussed today. Thank you so much for your attendance.